Hi, this is week 6 of Experiment and Adaptation. This session is going to be a little bit different to the ones you've had so far, in that I'm talking today with my co-screenwriters. We're going to have a bit of a kind of discussion about adaptation and Fairytale and how they both play into our writing. So I'll introduce them firstly. Makenzie Leigh and I have been friends for a really long time. She is an actor, writer and director. As an actor, she's appeared in various film and TV, such as working with directors Ang Lee and Lisa Cholodenko and Steven Soderbergh. She's also appeared in TV shows like Gotham and Mozart in the Jungle. And she just finished the film adaptation, strangely enough, of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. She and I co-wrote a short film based on a Jenny Diskey short story called The Vanishing Princess, that she then directed and starred in 2019. So we'll talk about that a bit as an adaptation. When we started writing our debut feature, we were joined by Brooke Mazurek, who is a screenwriter, journalist and editor whose work has appeared in publications including New York Times, Vanity Fair, GQ and Paper. She previously served as the senior features editor for Harper's Bazaar and a senior associate editor at Billboard. So now that I've done that, I'll kind of jump right in with the questions, and we'll think about how adaptation and Fairytale work for us as writers. So the first question is, how does adaptation play into what we do? So I'll just open that up, see if anyone wants to start.
Right. So I was saying kind of, obviously in the case of the short film, The Vanishing Princess, it plays in literally, because it was a short story and then we were adapting it to create a short film. But we'd all kind of talked about this question and said that in truth, like adaptation in a kind of more abstract form actually plays into everything we do, because we feel like we're always kind of adapting someone's work, even if we're not doing it formally. And yeah, that like as an artist, you're really just sort of the sum of all that you've read and experienced throughout life. And we feel like we're just always kind of extracting those internal reactions that we've had to stories that we've read and putting them on the page. And yeah, just that I kind of feel like I'm only ever reacting to something that someone else has said, and then I'm sort of saying, no, I see it this way. And that the source material is never like fully mine, because I don't, like live inside of a vacuum as a human.
Yeah, and I think that was what was funny about when I thought about doing this with you guys, was that I initially was like, oh yeah, because The Vanishing Princess is an adaptation, and then I kind of thought, oh, but the feature isn't an adaptation, but it kind of feels like it is, even though it isn't, just because of the influences were such an important part of the writing process that it doesn't feel separate from them, even though it's not technically an adaptation of any of them. But yeah, so no, I totally agree with that. I don't know if Brooke, you had anything.
I mean, I think it's like speaking to what the both of you and we're just saying, it is that thing of like, we as humans are constantly soaking in everything that we view or listen to. We don't exist in a vacuum. And I think there is this, even just thinking about like, if we go to like the music sphere, like there's a certain amount of notes on a piano or in the music scale. Everyone's kind of working from the same thing. You're all kind of like working with the same tools, and in the cultural zeitgeist kind of absorbing different things that are happening. So it is always this matter of like, all right, how am I hearing that, and kind of how is it feeding into my work, and how am I changing it up? So
yeah, totally. I think as well, something for me about when Mac and I started to write the Vanishing Princess, about it being such an amazing way into a media that wasn't something that I felt that comfortable with. So kind of coming from a kind of academic background and thinking that I felt really comfortable writing essays and that I loved watching film, but I'd never really thought about writing films. And then coming at it from the adaptation was just such an amazing way to sort of find confidence in it, because I had this framework of what I knew the story was and what I wanted it to be, and so I could, from that perspective, then play with what that would look like on a screen, how we would format that, and then starting with what Jenny Diskey had, and then slowly over time Mac and I sort of working out how to like bring our own voices to that and work out what we didn't need and have a bit more confidence to make those decisions, so that going into the feature it already felt like, okay, I know that I can do that with someone else's, can I do it with what I make myself?
And like, great. There's so much rejection, right, in the process of writing, that at least when it's someone else's work to start with, you're like, I know it's good. You're like, even if I screw it up, the core of the story is good. And so you kind of can trust in that and fall back on that, because later when you're doing your own work, you're like, I don't know.
Speak to having like scaffolding there, right? Yeah. It's like, you know, the bones and the framework are good, and just that scaffolding and security gives you like this sense of peace amid a process that can be really stressful and terrifying.
Just to give some context, then, how did The Vanishing Princess come about was the next thing I wanted us to talk about a bit. And I remembered it being partly because of my master's thesis, because I wrote a master's on Rapunzel, and I explored loads of different versions of Rapunzel, from kind of film to TV and poetry and stuff. And there was something about this one story by Jenny Diskey that really stuck out for me. And it was kind of a reimagining of Rapunzel, and yet it didn't have loads of the things we know of it. It didn't have the kind of hair falling out of the tower or any of that stuff, but it had a girl who didn't know anything else, who'd lived in this tower her whole life, and there is a door actually, but there's no way for her to get out of it, and that's kind of where Jenny had, like, Diskey had kind of started off from, and I really loved it, and at the time sent it to you, didn't I? It was like,
yeah. I was just thinking, but the hilarity is, like, it's not that there's no way to get out of it. She's just not curious, so she never tries the door. She's chilling in her tower.
That's true. But yeah, so you and then I sent it to you. I think I sent a few things to you, but then both of us just kind of like really, really loved that. And then at some point you were like, can we?
It was years later. That like I had always remembered it, and then I had this idea of like doing a short, and I couldn't grasp it. I was like, I don't have anything to say. And Jared was like, well, why don't you try and adapt something? And he was the one who was like, what about that story, The Vanishing Princess, that you're obsessed with? And I was like, oh God. So that was how it came about.
What were the challenges that came up during the writing process for that one, The Vanishing Princess?
Well, I'll jump in, even though I wasn't involved on the writing process for Vanishing Princess, but like because I came in to the group way late in the game, but I was at Makenzie's apartment to do a table read of like an early version of the script that you guys had written, and it was, what was it, like 5 of us and we sit down around a table, and we all have a version of the script, and we're reading it, and it was this really interesting thing of like kind of immediately being like, oh, there's an imbalance between how much the narrator of the story is telling us, the audience, like what's going on and how we're supposed to feel. And it was this like, it's a challenge that a lot of writers who are new to writing experience, which is like the age-old lesson of show me, don't tell me. Like, don't tell me in like glowing letters, like you're supposed to feel like this is funny, or or the character inside of her heart is feeling like nervous or curious or whatever. It's like this want as a writer to like make sure that people are getting what you're doing. And I think we kind of collectively had this moment of like, oh, we need to kind of scale back.
Yeah, and I think in a way what we were trapped in was this idea of it having a narrator, because we did want a narrator.
Yeah.
And this, in a way, the narrator felt really key to the story that she was telling.
And there's very much a voice of a narrator in the initial story. So we knew that you had to have that because that was the voice of kind of satire.
Yes.
Yeah. And we were overutilizing it.
Yeah, then we were like trapped with it because we couldn't then work out how to show. And it was, exactly that process of like trying to kind of get it back to it being a film, not
and I don't think we fully got there until the edit either.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really until the editing of the film that you could see, oh, actually we can pull that, we don't need to say that. Oh, actually we can pull that, we don't need to say that.
But it speaks that what you were talking about, the table read thing, was also one of the times that we read it again when you were over here once, and that was amazing too. There's something about just, you forget, I think, like even when you're writing a screenplay, we just forgot that if you don't read it with other people, you can't, because we'd read it with each other, like we'd read it to each other all the time, and it felt like that would be enough, but it just wasn't. I mean, every time we got other people to read it, it was like completely enlightening and it was immediately clear what needed to happen in a way that you couldn't get from like months of you reading it to each other.
Yeah, it's also kind of that thing of like, it's sometimes it gets so hard when you're looking at something for so long, right? You can't see the forest through the trees, and when you hear it aloud, it's akin to like watching a movie in a theater where you can pick up on the fact that someone's laughing or not laughing. So in that moment, it's a live criticism that you can feel and therefore take and put into the script.
I was thinking about what was it like making the film after we'd written it, like the editing and stuff, because I know that you were saying, Mac, about how it didn't really feel like we got some of the lines even, or like what needed to be cut until we got to the editing room. I was thinking about, even from a challenger's perspective, I was thinking about how when we wrote the script, we didn't really understand how important it was going to be to pass time when it came to actually making it. And so there was so many rewrites and so many like just having to deal with the fact that in this story, like time passes, but not in a way that you can show with like longer hair or
okay,
like, it was short amounts of time.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest lesson though that I learned about the passage, not just the passage of time, and this actually applies to, this is like such an issue, not just in film writing, but it was the first time I understood it in literary writing as well, which is that the way that Amy and I had initially written it, you really like got to see every exit and entrance from this tower. And our cinematographer, Karina Silva, kept being like, you guys, like the audience can put together that someone came in the door. Like, you don't have to show it every time. And it wasn't, I kind of got that, but on the day I still kept just my anxiety being like, I don't know. And I was like, can we just shoot the entrance? Can we just get her to go through the door? And then at the edit, it was so clear. Like, of course you can, how much the audience jumps with you through transitions. And it's such a hard thing as a writer, because the great writers, by the time you're reading their books, already know how to do it. But it's the transitions of like, how do I get this character to 1 week later? And actually how much you can basically take whatever it is that you wrote, what you thought the audience needed to get you from here to here, just like chuck it out. And the audience will go with you. You can just start in the middle of the action. And so that was like a huge kind of lesson in terms of how to cut and jump through time.
So let's talk about the feature a bit now. So how did we start the feature? My memory started with Mac's dream. Yeah. Mac had a dream.
I had a dream. I don't know if I'm going to tell you about that dream.
No, don't tell me about the dream.
Because we want you to watch the film. It's speakers.
But I think the point was that you had a dream. You had a dream and you came to me and you were like, I've had this dream. I feel like it's something. I feel like it's got something to it that I'm so fascinated by.
It was, I like, I feel comfortable to say it was kind of a dream that was a horror, and
it had a horror
nightmare, I guess we call it in the world.
that's a great thing to say, because actually that was part of what I remember you coming to me and saying, I've had this dream, and I know that if you're writing a feature, like your debut feature, doing a horror is a great way in, because the market's so much bigger than a drama or anything like that. And I was like, oh, horror's not really my bag. Like, I like it, but I hadn't really watched much of it, or, you know what I mean? I didn't really have opinions about it. But I was like, yeah, I'm into that. Let's try and do that, because that sounds like a good plan. And the dream was really scary and felt like it touched on a lot of things that we were both kind of interested in.
Yeah.
Weirdly. And then from there, how did the Twilight?
You were more open than I was, because basically, like, my window, or like Rashomon view of the whole thing is like, you know, we were trying to adapt, I won't say whose work, but we're trying to adapt someone else's short story into like a different film project. And like,
oh yeah,
and I were like,
that was a whole different thing.
That was like a whole other like avenue. Right. And Matt and I are like sitting at this table one day, freaking like trying to crank out pages of like potentially adapting this person's work, and we're just hitting roadblocks and roadblocks and roadblocks. And I'm like driving Mac to this train station to go, like, she was going home, and she's like, I had this dream. And she tells me and she's like, it's really an interesting dream. And she tells me the dream, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, yeah, cool, great dream. Like, that's interesting.
Yeah, when a friend tells you about their dream. So
you love a dream story.
Love a dream story.
And I was like, okay, but when are we going to keep working on this thing that we're getting nowhere with? So like, it took me a hot minute. And then it was this interesting thing of like, okay, wait, a couple days go by, I'm thinking about this dream that Makenzie had. And then meanwhile, you know, you're like in the kitchen, there's this cauldron, and you're getting like different things that are kind of coming into the mix. So we've got like Mac's dream. Then we've got...
For a minute, I thought you were in a literal kitchen with a cauldron, not a metaphorical cauldron. I was like, wait.
We're in the writing kitchen. Like, wow. Train station.
Just to add to that though as well, it's important that part of the reason I think that we didn't end up adapting that person's work was because it was too hard to get the rights. No?
That's right.
Right, so that's a good thing to say, is that sometimes you go down that route and you spend quite a lot of time being like, what would we do if we had the rights to this? And then you go, oh no, we don't get the rights.
Yeah. In our metaphorical writing kitchen, we've got our cauldron, we've got Mac's dream, we've got like the influence, like Mac and Amy, you guys had been like, read the Stefan Zweig novella. Like, again, the language is gorgeous, like it's so beautiful. And so like, the point is we start getting like a group mix of like different things we're feeling inspired by. And the last thing I'll say is like, the other way that this feature started is that I think the three of us have a really cool dynamic of sitting down and being like, well, what do we want to talk about? Like, what are we interested in right now? What's happening in the world? Or what are the things that we have like an opinion on right now? And kind of through that dialogue, that just starts kind of leading the way of like, okay, where are we going and what are we writing?
And two things I'll add to that is, one, I think we've distilled it into not just what do we have an opinion about, but what are we fearful of, and then what are we infuriated by.
Infuriated is 100%. So
it's somewhere in between like anger and fear, and then we're all like, okay, we're all angry and fearful, so let's do that.
I talk about that a lot actually, like when I'm teaching this idea that also for me it's about, I always talk about it as something being a bit knotty. Like we respond as a group, I think, to things that are not very simple, like things that are a bit like, I feel like I know how I feel about this, but I understand the other side, and it's a bit like, oh, and I don't know how to totally express. And I guess that's part of what keeps us interesting in projects, is when we have that feeling about some element of it that we can keep exploring and being like, whoa, what is that? And like trying to push at it and see if we can get where we want to go. And so all of those things kind of came together to be this feature, which actually changed a lot in the process of writing it. And just before we finish, I'd love to just talk a little bit about our influences more broadly. So what kind of texts were inspiring us, and maybe like, I don't know, we see it as intertextual, but I mean, if we feel like that, but essentially just, yeah, what were the other kind of inspirations for what we were doing in this one?
So Karen Russell, obviously.
Yes, Karen Russell. Yeah, American short story writer. And we had, and that was you guys basically introduced me to her, because I didn't know who she was. And she was, yeah, really important. We also had this sense of, there was definitely the fairy tale element. There was also a kind of Faustian pact that became really central, this sort of devil in disguise thing, that was also really important structurally, I'd say, the Faust narrative. And we had I was thinking about how, because I was thinking, we thought a lot about it, that particularly the Faustian pact thing in a way, and the iterations of that in films that we really liked. So even though Rosemary's Baby doesn't have a Faustian pact, in that's like not her choice, there is like a moment in that film when the devil comes to her and there's no turning back from that moment. And similarly with Get Out, which was another really important like inspiration for us, there was that sense of like, once he crosses the threshold into that house, he can't go back, which is a really common feature of horror in general. Like there's always a moment when you cross over, and maybe even story, like there's usually a crossing of a threshold, isn't there? And there's something about horror that speaks to that in terms of like a house, but also like a pact or something that's been like that devil element of it was quite important to us, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I would say, like, with those film references as well, like there was also the feeling of chasing a feeling. Like the three of us had these kind of things that we loved, you know, Karen Russell's magical realism, like Rosemary's Baby, Get Out. But with those, it was like, I think there was always part of our conversation was like, we want people to feel what we felt watching those movies. And there is this kind of like chasing a feeling and something you can't articulate, but knowing like, oh, I've like I'll never forget seeing Get Out for the first time and being like, oh my gosh, my mind is blown, and I'm having like a physical reaction to what they've done with this story. And I think like that's also such a terrifying and exciting thing as a writer, to be like, I don't want to do exactly what they did, but I want the end result to like land my viewers right there.
The one kind of thing you have to be careful of when you're referencing all these epic pieces of work from these brilliant artists is that throughout the process you're writing and thinking like, oh, our script isn't that, like how are we going to measure up, and yeah, it's like what the end result of what you're looking at is like a masterpiece, and what you're working on is a work in progress that isn't yet.
I guess it's like knowing when to step away from like the masterpiece, where you're like, okay, I'm gonna turn my TV off now and like go into my own world. Yeah, like I need to let go of that life.
Yeah, letting the influences, because we did that with the Fairytale too. Like I think there were times where we went really down the Bluebeard route, and then we were suddenly like, this isn't our film. Like, what are we doing? Like we didn't have
we have a habit of like overtaking a reference and then pull back.
Yeah, we go really full for our inspirations, like full on, and then we're like, oh wait, no, that's that we just made their film again. Cool. Back it up. Trying not to do an adaptation here. Yes. Great. I think that's pretty much everything I was going to cover. But thank you guys so much. It's great to chat to you, as I do most days. Thank you.